Let's talk about one of the most nerve-wracking parts of any real estate deal, the appraisal. That big official report that shows up and can literally make or break a transaction. It can feel like a mystery box, but it's actually a pretty logical process. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and figure out how it all works.
So let's start with the big question. What is a home really worth? See, unlike a stock that has a price ticking up and down all day, a home's value, well, it's kind of subjective, isn't it? It depends on the market, the location, its condition, and yeah, even how a buyer's feeling that day. And that uncertainty is exactly why the appraisal exists in the first place.
And this is where we need to get one thing straight, because this is a super important distinction. The price is just what someone agrees to pay. But the value, that's what an appraiser is trying to figure out. It's the most probable price the home should sell for. And believe me, those two numbers are not always the same. Okay, so here's our game plan for breaking this all down. First, we'll cover what an appraisal is and why it matters. Then, we'll get inside an appraiser's head and look at their guiding principles. After that, we'll explore the three main ways they calculate value. Then, we'll see how it all comes together in a final number, and most importantly, what all this means for you.
All right, Section 1, the expert opinion. Let's demystify what this opinion of value actually is.
So, at the end of the day, an appraisal is just that, a professional's opinion of what a property is worth. But here's the thing you have to remember. The appraisal isn't really for the buyer or the seller. Its number one job is to protect the lender. The bank wants to be absolutely sure that if you stop paying your mortgage, they can sell the house and get their money back. It's their safety net. And the specific thing they're looking for is called market value. You can kind of think of this as the perfect world price. It's the value assuming everyone involved is smart, informed, and nobody's desperate to make a deal. It's the ideal benchmark they're always aiming for. Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. What happens if the appraisal comes in lower than the price you agreed on? The bank will only lend you money based on that lower appraised value. That leaves you with pretty much three options. 1, the whole deal just falls apart. 2, the seller can agree to lower the price to match the appraisal. Or 3, you, the buyer, have to find the cash to make up the difference.
So, how do appraisers figure all this out? Well, they're not just pulling numbers out of thin air. Their entire process is built on a foundation of core economic ideas. Let's get into Section 2 and see how an appraiser actually thinks.
First off, before a property can have any value at all, it needs to have 4 basic things. A simple way to remember them is the acronym DUST. There has to be demand for it. It needs utility. It has to be useful for something. There has to be some level of scarcity. And finally, it has to be transferable. You have to be able to legally sell it. If you're missing even one of these, the value can completely disappear. Now, if you remember one thing from this section, make it this one. The principle of substitution is the absolute bedrock of residential appraising. The logic is so simple. Why would you ever pay $500,000 for a house if there's a nearly identical one just down the street for sale for $480,000? You wouldn't. And that is exactly why appraisers are so obsessed with comps or comparable sales. And that leads to another huge concept. Cost does not equal value. This is called the principle of contribution. It means that just because you spent money on an upgrade, it doesn't mean your home's value went up by that same amount. That beautiful $50,000 pool you just put in, an appraiser might look at the local market and decide it only adds $20,000 in actual value. That can be a really tough pill for homeowners to swallow. And finally, we have the principle of conformity. Basically, a home is worth the most when it fits in with its neighbors in style, size, quality, everything. If you build a giant 6-bedroom mansion in a neighborhood full of small 2-bedroom bungalows, you've created the oddball house. And that house's value is almost always going to be dragged down by the more modest homes around it. So, with those principles as their guide, appraisers have 3 main methods they can use to actually calculate a number. Let's move on to Section 3, the 3 paths to a price. Path number 1, and by far the most common one for a regular home, is the sales comparison approach. This is the principle of substitution put into practice. The appraiser goes out and finds at least 3 similar homes that have sold nearby very recently and uses those sale prices as a starting point. Of course, no 2 houses are ever exactly the same, so they have to make adjustments. Let's walk through this table. So the comparable home sold for $165,250, but our house, the subject property, has an extra half bath. The appraiser decides that's worth about $2,500, so they add it to the comp's price. Our house also has a fireplace and the comp doesn't, so they add another $1,400. After those tweaks, the adjusted price of that one comp is $169,150. They'll do this for a few different comps to narrow in on the right value.
But what if you can't find any good comps? I mean, what if you're appraising a church or a brand new custom home? That's when they use Path 2, the cost approach. The idea here is, what would it cost to just build this thing from scratch today? They figure out the replacement cost, subtract any depreciation for age and wear, and then add in the value of the land it's sitting on. And a really interesting part of that depreciation calculation is the difference between chronological age and effective age. A house might have been built 20 years ago. That's its chronological age. But if it's been perfectly maintained and totally updated, an appraiser might say its effective age is only 10 years old. A lower effective age means less depreciation, which means a higher value. Path number 3 is the income approach, and this one's pretty specialized. You really only use it for investment properties. Think apartment buildings or duplexes. For these properties, value isn't about the granite countertops. It's about one thing: how much money can this property generate? One of the simpler ways they do this is with something called the gross rent multiplier, or GRM. First, the appraiser looks at what other rental properties in the area sold for and what they were renting for each month. They divide the sale price by the rent to get that multiplier. Then, they just multiply your property's potential rent by that same number to get an estimate of its value. It's a quick way to see value through an investor's eyes. Okay, so we've got up to 3 different values from 3 totally different methods. How on earth does an appraiser turn all that into one single number? Well, that brings us to Section 4, the final verdict. This final step is called reconciliation, and I have to stress this is not just taking the average of the 3 numbers. That's not how it works. The appraiser looks at the data and uses their professional judgment to decide which approach is the most credible for this specific property. For your house, they'll probably put almost all the weight on the sales comparison approach. For a school, it's the cost approach. It's about weighing the evidence to get to one defensible number. Which brings us to our last and maybe most important section, what it means for you. How do you take this dense report and actually make it useful? Look, we already said the appraisal's main job is to protect the lender, but that doesn't mean it's not an incredibly powerful tool for you too. It gives you an objective, expert opinion on value. For a buyer, it's your protection against overpaying. For a seller, it's a reality check that can help you price your home correctly from the get-go. It's a shot of pure data in what can be a very emotional process. Because at the end of the day, an appraisal isn't a final, unchangeable fact. It's a well-researched, expert opinion based on the data available at that exact moment in time. So the real question isn't what the number is, but what you do with it. Armed with this information, how are you going to use it to make the absolute best decision for yourself?